If you can read the I Ching text but still cannot judge the actual situation, the problem may not be your intuition. It may be the missing structure.
For many people, the I Ching starts in a very simple way. You pick up a translated book, cast coins, get a hexagram, then read the judgment, the changing line text, and maybe add some philosophical interpretation, psychological interpretation, or spiritual reflection. And of course, that is a real way to use the I Ching. Even in China, some people do read only the hexagram and line text when interpreting a divination. But that is not the whole picture. Let me say something that may make you feel a little better. If you read the judgment and line text and think, okay, I understand some of the words, but I still don't know how to judge this actual situation, that is not just your problem. Many Chinese readers feel the same way when they read a Zhouyi, so don't worry, you're not alone. The problem is not that you fail to understand some mysterious Eastern wisdom. The problem is that the Zhouyi itself is an extremely old, compressed, symbolic, and difficult classic. In ancient China, people who could really study the Yi deeply or use I Ching divination seriously were often trained scholars, classicists, technical specialists, or professional diviners. Even among ancient Chinese literati, someone could study the Yi for decades and still not dare to say, now I fully understand it. And if we go even further back, early Chinese divination was not like today's self-help practice, where anyone can pick up a book, throw a few coins, and read a short passage. It was closely connected with real situations, royal power, ritual offerings, war, agriculture, illness, family matters, and major decisions. Shang Dynasty oracle bone divination is a very good example. Many oracle bone inscriptions ask about ritual offerings, war, weather, harvest, illness, and dreams. These were matters of the royal house and the state. But they did not only ask about big things. Among the Huayuanzhuang East oracle bone inscriptions discovered at the Yin ruins, there is one inscription that people sometimes jokingly call a 3,000-year-old sick leaf note. The inscription says, 子其义，往往学. Roughly speaking, it means that a young royal child was unwell, and they divined about his illness and whether he should still go to school. You can even imagine the joke. Maybe this young prince brought the divination shell to his teacher and said, look, even the ancestors said I don't have to go to school today. So maybe the struggle with going to school is not a modern problem at all. It may be 3,000 years old. But this example is useful. It shows that Shang royal divination was not only about war, ritual, and harvest. It could also enter illness, education, and everyday life. Some oracle bone inscriptions even ask very ordinary questions, like what to eat that day. But the point is not ancient people were superstitious. The point is this. Ancient divination was not about reading one sentence in a vacuum. The people interpreting the divination knew the background, and they also had an interpretive system. So ancient divination often depended on two things. First, the actual background information. Second, the system used to interpret it. When ancient people looked at a line text or an oracle bone inscription, they did not read it as an isolated sentence. They placed it back into the question, the real situation, the social relationship, the divination context, the hexagram image, the line position, and the accumulated experience of interpretation. That is why getting a hexagram does not mean you know how to interpret it. And reading the judgment and line text does not mean you know how to judge a real-life situation. In other words, if we only have the hexagram and the text, but we do not have timing, position, relationship, movement, the 5 elements, the significator line, and the images, many practical questions become very hard to judge. It is not that you lack intuition. You lack structure. Why does the I Ching feel difficult? In the previous slide, we talked about one important point. Getting a hexagram does not mean you know how to interpret it. And reading the judgment and the change in line text does not always tell you how to judge a real-life situation. So here, let's go one level deeper. Why is it so difficult if we only rely on the judgment and the line text? Because they are not ordinary instructions. They are very old, very compressed, and highly symbolic. More importantly, behind them, there is a whole system of image, number, and principle. In the Chinese tradition, there is a saying, before studying the Yi, first study divination. This does not mean the judgment and line texts are not important. Of course they are important. But if you enter the Yi only through these highly compressed classical texts, it can be very hard. Sometimes it is easier to begin with divination practice. You first learn how hexagram images, line positions, active lines, timing, relationships, and real-life outcomes connect with each other. Then, when you go back to the classical text, the text starts to make much more sense. So here we need to talk about three key layers of the Yi: image, number, and principle. Image means the forms, scenes, and phenomena we can observe. Heaven, earth, water, fire, wind, thunder, mountain, and lake are natural images. Parents, men and women, roads, houses, illness, and wealth are human life images. The I Ching does not begin by speaking in abstract ideas. It begins by observing the world and then turning those observations into hexagram images. This is what the Chinese tradition calls observing things and taking images. Number does not only mean numbers. It means order, stages, rhythm, timing, and points of change. For example, yin and yang, line positions, active lines, cycles, stems and branches, the 5 elements, and whether something is just beginning, growing stronger, declining, or reaching a turning point. Principle is the logic we draw from image and number. It is the deeper pattern behind the change and the reasoning that allows us to make a judgment. So, in simple terms, image is what you see. Number is where it stands in time, position, stage, and relationship. Principle is what you understand from it and how it may change next. Let me give a simple example. You see a leaf falling. That is image. It falls in autumn at a certain speed, in a certain direction, in a certain environment. That is number. From this, you understand that the season is changing, things are contracting, and what is reached fullness begins to decline. That is principle. So again, the judgment and line text are important. But without image and number, beginners can easily read them as abstract inspiration and still not know how to judge a real situation. This brings us to one of the most important lines in this lesson. Text travels more easily than technique. Text is easier to translate. Philosophy is easier to discuss. Psychological interpretation is easier to spread. Casting rituals are also easier to imitate. But a technical system is much harder to transmit, because technique is not just a few words. It is a whole discipline. It includes how to cast, how to build the chart, how to identify the significator, how to read active lines, how to read timing, how to read relationships, and how to judge the outcome. So the problem is not that students learn the I Ching incorrectly. The problem is that the transmission was incomplete. The text was transmitted. Philosophical interpretations were transmitted. Psychological interpretations developed. Casting rituals were transmitted. But the structured technical system used in Chinese practical divination was not fully transmitted. That is why many students eventually get stuck. Not because they need more inspiration, but because they need structure. This video is a selected excerpt from the I Ching Divination Foundations course. New complete lessons are released every week, and the course is currently available at the early enrollment price. The price will increase after all 11 lessons have been published. You can find the complete course through the link below.